Jasmine Carter strode into the bank, her heels clicking against the polished tile floor. She was here for a simple transaction, just a quick transfer from her business account. Nothing complicated. She adjusted the strap of her leather portfolio and inhaled deeply, preparing for what should have been an uneventful visit. The bank lobby bustled with activity. Customers stood in line, tellers handled transactions, and the low hum of conversations filled the air. But as Jasmine stepped forward, she felt something shift. It wasn't immediate, but subtle, an unmistakable shift in atmosphere. She caught a few glances from the bank employees. They were quick, fleeting, but enough to trigger a familiar unease. Jasmine wasn't the type to imagine slights where there were none. She had built Carter Enterprises from the ground up, and she had navigated boardrooms full of skeptical eyes. But here, in this moment, she could feel the quiet judgment creeping in. By the time she reached the counter, she had already prepared herself. She met the teller's gaze, Karen Whitman. A woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a crisp cardigan, her lips pursed in a way that suggested disapproval before Jasmine had even spoken. "Good afternoon," Jasmine greeted, keeping her tone professional. "I'd like to make a transfer from my business account and review some holdings." Karen barely looked at her. Instead, she skimmed Jasmine's attire, her expensive but understated blazer, her neatly styled hair, and then, with a smirk that made Jasmine's stomach tighten, Karen finally spoke. "And what kind of business do you run?" It wasn't curiosity, it was doubt, wrapped in a question. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she didn't let the irritation show. She had been here before, the subtle yet unmistakable disbelief, the unspoken suggestion that she didn't belong. But she wasn't about to let Karen Whitman rattle her. She gave a poised smile. "Carter Enterprises," she replied smoothly. "You should find it in your system. We've been banking here for years." Karen's lips curled slightly, almost as if she were amused. She murmured, tapping at her keyboard with exaggerated slowness. "I see a lot of names in this system. You're going to have to be more specific." Jasmine arched an eyebrow. "The account is under Carter Enterprises, registered as a corporate business account. The documents I have here should verify everything." Karen didn't reach for the papers. Instead, she leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. "A corporate business account?" she repeated, her tone laced with doubt. "And you're the owner?" Jasmine exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay composed. "Yes," she confirmed. Karen tilted her head. "Well, I'll need more than just your word," she said flatly. "Do you have proof? A debit card with your company's name? A checkbook?" Jasmine narrowed her eyes. "I just told you, I have all the necessary paperwork." She gestured to the folder in her hands. "Bank statements, tax documents, ownership filings, everything your bank requires." Karen sighed dramatically, as if Jasmine were inconveniencing her. Then, finally, she reached for the documents, flipping through them with deliberate sluggishness. Jasmine could feel the weight of other customers' eyes on them now. She knew what was happening. This wasn't just banking protocol. This was something else entirely. Jasmine stood tall, watching Karen skim through her documents with an air of disinterest. The teller barely glanced at the papers before shaking her head. "This isn't enough," Karen said, pushing the folder back across the counter. Jasmine's fingers tensed around the leather portfolio. Not enough? She had brought everything: tax filings, statements, ownership records, documents that had been more than enough every other time she had done business here. "What exactly is missing?" Jasmine asked, keeping her voice steady. Karen let out a breathy chuckle, shaking her head as if Jasmine should already know the answer. "Look, I'm just doing my job. You wouldn't believe the fraud we see in here." There it was, the real reason behind the scrutiny, the assumption, the quiet accusation beneath the surface. Jasmine wasn't being viewed as a respected business owner. She was being scrutinized as a potential fraudster. Jasmine took a deep breath. "Fraud?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. Karen shrugged. "People come in all the time, claiming they own businesses, trying to pull scams. It's my responsibility to make sure everything checks out." Jasmine knew what was happening. This wasn't due diligence, it was bias disguised as caution. And it wasn't the first time she had faced it. "Let me get this straight," Jasmine said, placing her hands firmly on the counter. "You're saying that official tax records, bank statements, and ownership filings aren't enough to verify my own account?" Karen pursed her lips. I'm saying we have certain precautions. Jasmine exhaled slowly. She had two choices: walk away, let this moment pass, or call this out for what it was. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. When someone tries to diminish you, hold your ground. Jasmine straightened her shoulders. I'd like to speak to your manager. A hush fell over the room. Karen's smirk flickered, just for a second. And Jasmine knew this was about to get interesting. Karen's smirk twisted into something colder, but for the first time there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She hadn't expected Jasmine to challenge her, to demand accountability. A few customers had turned their heads now, sensing the tension. The hum of the bank had quieted just slightly, as if people were tuning in. Karen sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. Fine, she muttered, pressing a button on her desk. If you insist. Jasmine kept her posture poised, but inside her pulse was steady and focused. She had spent years dealing with people like Karen, those who wielded their authority like a weapon, assuming no one would push back. The manager arrived within minutes, a tall man in a sharp navy suit. His name tag read Michael Hayes, and his brow furrowed slightly as he took in the scene. What seems to be the issue? He asked, his voice neutral, but Jasmine caught the curiosity behind it. Karen straightened, putting on a polite but overly rehearsed smile. Oh, no real issue, she said sweetly. This customer is requesting a large transfer, and I'm just following protocol to ensure everything is legitimate. Jasmine didn't let her face betray the injustice of that carefully chosen wording. She took a step forward. What I actually requested was a routine transfer from my business account. I provided all necessary documentation, but Miss Whitman is refusing to process it. Michael's gaze flicked between them. He gestured toward the folder on the counter. May I? Jasmine nodded, sliding it over. He flipped through the papers with the efficiency of someone who actually knew what he was looking for. Within seconds, his expression shifted. Just slightly, but enough. This is all in order, he said finally, his tone sharp. Karen, why was this flagged as an issue? Karen hesitated. I was just being cautious, she stammered. Jasmine folded her arms. Or were you just making assumptions? Karen's face paled slightly. She had underestimated her, and now everyone was watching. A heavy silence settled over the bank. The tension was thick, the kind that made people pause mid-task, their curiosity piqued. Karen's fingers twitched slightly on the counter, but she quickly masked her unease with a tight-lipped smile. I was simply following protocol, she repeated, her voice straining for control. Michael Hayes, the manager, wasn't buying it. He flipped through the documents once more before placing them down with an air of finality. This paperwork is complete, he said, his tone firmer now, and I see no reason why Miss Carter's transaction shouldn't have been processed immediately. Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, but Michael raised a hand, silencing her. He wasn't interested in excuses. Jasmine watched Karen's face shift, the confidence cracking, the smirk faltering. But still, there was a lingering defiance in her eyes, as if she believed she could still come out of this unscathed. Jasmine wasn't about to let that happen. She stepped forward, her voice clear and controlled. Miss Whitman, let's be honest. This wasn't about protocol. It was about something else entirely. Karen stiffened. You doubted me, Jasmine continued, her words measured but cutting. You assumed that I couldn't possibly own a business account large enough to make this transaction, and when I provided proof, you still found reasons to delay and question me. Michael's jaw tightened. He turned to Karen. Is this true? Karen let out a breath, frustration flashing across her face. I was just doing my job, she muttered. Michael's expression darkened. Your job is to assist customers, not make baseless assumptions about them. A few people in line murmured amongst themselves. Jasmine felt the shift in the room, the weight of truth settling over everyone. Karen was officially cornered, and Jasmine wasn't done yet. Karen's posture stiffened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. The weight of the situation was pressing down on her, but her pride wouldn't let her admit fault. I was only trying to protect the bank, she muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. Michael Hayes, the manager, let out a slow breath, clearly holding back frustration. Protect the bank from what, exactly? He asked, his tone dangerously calm. Karen floundered for an answer. I was just being cautious about fraud. Jasmine let out a soft, humorless chuckle. Fraud? She repeated. Let's be clear. What you were being cautious about was me. Not the paperwork, not the numbers. Me. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Customers were no longer pretending not to listen. A few had turned fully toward the counter, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet outrage. Michael nodded, his gaze sharpening. Miss Carter is a longtime account holder with all the proper documentation. If you claim this is about protocol, I'd like to know why you didn't apply the same level of scrutiny to the last 5 transactions I saw you process today. Karen's face went pale. Jasmine folded her arms, waiting. She didn't need to press further. Michael was handling it now. The bank was no longer on Karen's side. She shifted on her feet, glancing around as if searching for an escape. She started, but Michael cut her off. I think we've heard enough, he said firmly. Jasmine felt the energy in the room shift completely. Karen had spent the entire interaction holding the power. But now, she was the one being questioned, and she had no answers. Karen's false confidence crumbled under the weight of the stares around her. The bank had been her domain, a place where she could operate with unchecked authority. But now, with Michael's sharp gaze pinned on her, that authority was slipping away. Michael turned toward Jasmine. Miss Carter, I sincerely apologize for this situation. This is not how we conduct business at this bank. Karen's mouth fell open slightly. Apologizing? To her? Jasmine nodded, keeping her expression composed. An apology is a start, she said, her voice clear. But let's not act like this is an isolated incident. A ripple of murmurs passed through the bank. A few customers shifted uncomfortably while others nodded, clearly recognizing the truth in Jasmine's words. Michael's jaw tightened. He glanced around, sensing the shifting mood in the room. I understand, he said carefully, and I'd like to assure you that this matter will be handled appropriately. Karen stiffened. Handled? She echoed, a hint of fear creeping into her voice. Michael turned back to her. Yes, Karen. Handled. Karen swallowed hard, glancing toward the security guard near the entrance, as if hoping for backup. But no one was coming to her defense. Jasmine took a small step forward, her voice unwavering. Miss Whitman, do you know what the worst part of all this is? Karen didn't answer. She simply stared, trapped. It's that you never even considered that you might be wrong, Jasmine continued. You assumed I didn't belong, and even when faced with the truth, you refused to admit it. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Karen, once the one in control, was now the one on trial, and everyone was watching. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the front of her cardigan. Her usual air of confidence had been stripped away, leaving only a brittle shell of defiance. Michael sighed, rubbing his temples before addressing her again. Karen, I need to ask you something. Have you treated other customers this way? Karen's head snapped up. Of course not, she said quickly, too quickly. Jasmine arched an eyebrow. So it's just me then? Karen flinched, but she said nothing. The silence spoke louder than any excuse she could have made. Michael's expression darkened. That's unacceptable. He gestured to a side office. Karen, I need you to step inside for a discussion about your conduct, right now. A few people in line whispered among themselves. The atmosphere in the bank had completely shifted. What had started as a normal afternoon had turned into a public reckoning. Karen hesitated, her gaze darting between Michael and Jasmine. She looked like she wanted to argue, but there was no argument left to make. She stopped herself, swallowed. Then, with a final glance at the gathered customers, she turned and walked stiffly toward the office. Jasmine exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her shoulders start to ease. She had done it. She had stood her ground, and this time, she hadn't been dismissed. Michael turned to her. Miss Carter, we appreciate your patience. I'll personally make sure your transaction is completed immediately. Jasmine nodded, her voice steady. Thank you, but I hope you'll also be reviewing how employees like Karen interact with customers. Because I promise you, I'm not the first person she's done this to. Michael's expression hardened. You have my word. The room was still heavy with unspoken tension, but something had shifted. A boundary had been set, a lesson had been learned, and Karen Whitman had just faced the consequences of her own prejudice. As Karen disappeared into the manager's office, the energy in the bank completely shifted. The quiet murmurs among customers turned into full conversations, people exchanging glances as if they had just witnessed something historic. Jasmine stood tall, her pulse still steadying from the confrontation. She wasn't just relieved, she was proud. Michael gestured toward another teller. "Please process Miss Carter's transaction right away." The new teller, a young woman with nervous eyes, hurried to assist. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't hesitate, she simply did her job. The contrast between her and Karen was striking. As Jasmine handed over her documents, an older woman nearby spoke up. "Good for you, young lady," she said, her voice warm. "You handled that with real grace." Jasmine turned and smiled. "Thank you." A man in a business suit added, "Honestly, I've seen her act that way before. She finally got called out." Another customer nodded. "I always thought she was rude, but I never said anything." Jasmine took in their words with a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was validating to know others had noticed Karen's behavior. On the other, why had no one spoken up before? Michael must have sensed her thoughts. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I know this doesn't erase what happened, but I appreciate you saying something. Some people let things slide for too long." Jasmine met his gaze. "Letting things slide is how problems like this keep happening." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. The new teller handed Jasmine her receipt. "All set, ma'am." Jasmine took it and smiled. "Thank you." As she turned to leave, she could feel the weight of the moment lingering in the air. Something had changed in that bank today, and people would remember it. As Jasmine walked toward the exit, she felt the eyes of nearly every customer on her. Not in judgment, but in quiet respect. It was as if she had given a voice to something many had experienced but never spoken about. Just before she reached the door, a man in his late 50s, dressed in a simple yet professional outfit, approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me, miss," he said, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to say that was impressive." Jasmine paused, offering a polite but curious smile. "Thank you," he sighed, shaking his head. "I've been banking here for years, and I've seen things, little moments, just like what you went through, but I've never seen anyone actually stand up to it." Jasmine tilted her head. "Why do you think that is?" The man hesitated before answering. "Fear, I guess. Fear of causing a scene. Fear of being labeled difficult." He chuckled bitterly. "People don't realize that silence is what lets these things keep happening." Jasmine nodded. "Exactly." Before he could say more, the door to Michael's office swung open. Karen Whitman stepped out, her face ashen, her usual sharpness dulled. She looked around, as if suddenly aware of all the eyes still on her. Michael followed, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Karen before turning toward the gathered customers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to assure you that our bank takes professionalism and fairness seriously. Any behavior that goes against those values will not be tolerated." Karen flinched. The implication was clear. A hush fell over the room. Some customers exchanged knowing glances. Others simply watched, waiting. Karen's gaze landed on Jasmine. For the first time there was no smirk, no dismissive air, just quiet recognition of her mistake. Jasmine met her eyes, then nodded slightly. Not in victory, but in understanding. Because this wasn't just about Karen. It was about setting a standard, and that standard had just been raised. The weight of Michael's words settled over the room like a thick fog. The silence was no longer awkward, it was expectant. Everyone knew something important had just happened, but no one wanted to be the first to react. Karen stood stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her. She was clearly struggling to maintain composure, but her arrogance had crumbled. Michael's voice broke the silence. "Miss Carter, I'd like to formally apologize on behalf of this bank." Jasmine, standing tall and composed, nodded. "I appreciate that, but an apology isn't enough." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's eyes widened slightly, as if she had expected everything to end there. A simple sorry and business as usual. Michael tilted his head. "What do you suggest?" Jasmine took a slow breath. "This isn't just about me. I guarantee I'm not the first person she's treated this way. If you're serious about fairness, then this bank needs to take action. Real action." Michael's lips pressed into a firm line. He turned to Karen. "Miss Whitman, effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full review of your conduct." Gasps spread through the room. Karen's face drained of color. "Suspended?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You'll be required to undergo retraining, Michael continued. If we find any further reports of discrimination, your employment here will be terminated. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She had no defense. Jasmine could feel the shift in the air, the acknowledgement that something had changed. No longer could discrimination be swept under the rug with forced smiles and empty apologies. There were consequences now. A woman in line clapped softly, then another. Within seconds, a wave of approval spread through the bank. Not loud, not mocking, but firm. Karen, humiliated but silent, gave a stiff nod and turned toward the back of the bank. Jasmine finally allowed herself to exhale. This wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for everyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or belittled, and the impact would last far beyond today. As Karen disappeared from sight, the tension in the bank slowly began to ease. The quiet murmurs grew into full conversations, and the employees behind the counters straightened their posture, as if realizing that today had set a new precedent. Jasmine turned back to Michael, who studied her with newfound respect. "I'll be following up," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I trust that this isn't just for show." Michael nodded. "It isn't. And if you or anyone else experiences anything like this again, I want to know immediately." Jasmine appreciated his words, but she also knew that true change required more than promises. Still, this was a step, a necessary one. A woman in a navy blue suit stepped forward, offering her hand. "Jasmine Carter, right?" she asked. Jasmine hesitated before shaking her hand. "Yes. I'm Denise Holloway. I work in corporate oversight for this bank." Her sharp, professional tone softened slightly. "I witnessed the whole thing, and I want you to know this won't just go away." Jasmine studied Denise's expression. She seemed sincere. "I appreciate that," Jasmine replied, "because if it does, I'll make sure people hear about it." Denise smiled slightly. "I have no doubt." Behind her, customers were still watching, some nodding in approval, others quietly processing what had just taken place. This wasn't something people would forget. Jasmine looked around, noticing how many employees had taken note of Karen's fate. A lesson had been taught today, and it had been received. As she turned to leave, a young bank teller, perhaps no older than 25, leaned toward her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jasmine met her eyes and nodded. Because that was what mattered most. Not just standing up for herself, but making sure others knew they could do the same. Jasmine stepped out of the bank, the cool air rushing against her skin. She had walked in expecting a routine transaction, but she was leaving knowing she had changed something. Maybe not the whole world, but at least this small corner of it. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out to see a flood of messages. "Maya. Girl, I just saw what happened. Someone filmed it. It's all over social media. David. You really shut that place down. Respect." Jasmine's brow furrowed. She clicked on the link Maya had sent. It was a video, a shaky phone recording of her confrontation with Karen. The caption read, "When being black at a bank means proving you belong." Her stomach flipped as she scrolled through the comments. She handled that with so much grace, respect. Why do we still have to deal with this in 2025? Disgusting. This woman is a boss. We need more people like her speaking out. Jasmine exhaled slowly. The moment hadn't just stayed in the bank, it had spread. She wasn't sure how to feel about that yet. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "Miss Carter?" She turned to see an older man, dressed in a dark suit. He had been in the bank earlier, one of the customers watching. "Yes?" she asked cautiously. He extended a hand. "Paul Jenkins. I'm on the board for this bank." Jasmine hesitated, then shook his hand. "I saw what you did in there," he said, "and I want you to know, you were right to speak up. There's a lot of work to be done, and people like you remind us of that." Jasmine studied him, trying to gauge if this was another empty promise or if he meant it. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. Paul nodded. "If you're willing, I'd like to talk about how we can make sure this doesn't happen again, not just here, but across all our branches." Jasmine felt a small, unexpected surge of hope. This had started as a fight for respect, but maybe, just maybe, it could become something bigger. Jasmine studied Paul Jenkins, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this a genuine opportunity for change or just another attempt at damage control? "I'm listening," she said, keeping her tone measured. Paul nodded. The truth is, this isn't the first time we've had complaints about discrimination at our branches, but it's the first time it's gone viral. His lips pressed into a thin line. Frankly, it's forcing us to take a harder look at our policies and training. Jasmine folded her arms. And what does that mean exactly? It means we need voices like yours to help us implement real change. He gestured toward a nearby cafe. Would you be willing to sit down and discuss what that could look like? Jasmine hesitated. She wasn't naive. She knew companies often made public gestures of change to quiet bad press. But she also knew that real progress only happened when people forced the issue. She exhaled, then nodded. I'll give you my time, but only if I see real action come from it. Paul gave a small, approving smile. That's exactly what we need, someone who holds us accountable. As they walked toward the cafe, Jasmine's phone vibrated again. Another message. Mom, I saw what happened. I'm so proud of you. Jasmine's chest tightened, emotions swelling inside her. She had grown up hearing her mother's stories, how she had been overlooked, doubted, dismissed. Jasmine had always vowed to do better, to demand better, and now it seemed she was finally doing just that. As she stepped into the cafe, she knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Seated across from Paul Jenkins in the cafe, Jasmine sipped her coffee, listening carefully. We're prepared to launch a full internal review, Paul explained. That includes retraining our staff, implementing stronger accountability measures, and increasing oversight on discrimination complaints. But I want your input. You've been on the other side of this. You know what needs to change. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. And how do I know this isn't just about cleaning up your image? Paul sighed. I won't lie to you. Bad press forces action, but real change only happens when people like you push for it. He leaned forward. So, push us. Jasmine studied him, weighing her decision. She didn't trust institutions easily. History had given her too many reasons not to. But she also knew that rejecting this outright meant nothing would change. All right, she said finally. Then let's start with real consequences for employees who discriminate. No more retraining as an excuse to keep bad actors in place. Paul nodded. Agreed. What else? Jasmine sat back, thinking. Community outreach, financial literacy programs for underserved communities, and transparency. Because if you're serious about change, people need to see it happening. A slow smile spread across Paul's face. I think you just found yourself a seat at the table. Jasmine exhaled, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had forced an entire institution to listen. As she left the cafe, her phone buzzed again, social media still exploding with reactions to her stand. But for Jasmine, the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in knowing that the next black customer who walked into that bank wouldn't have to fight the same battle, because she already had. And she had won. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Let's keep the conversation going. Have you ever faced discrimination in a public space? How did you handle it? Subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. Together, we can shine a light on these issues and push for real change.